thank you to everyone for participating and organizing this event. Second, as stated, my topic is on contemporary Cyprus. For those of you who are unaware or who are aware of the history of Cyprus, please forgive me for the next 45 seconds or so. I know it's not something that is necessarily part of modern parlance. So Cyprus is an island in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was granted by the Ottomans to the British in 1878 and remained a British colony until 1960. At that time, roughly 13% of the population was Turkish, identified as Turkish, spoke Turkish, and were Muslim. The other 87 were Greek Orthodox Christians. In 1949, the Orthodox Church on Cyprus held a referendum for enosis, which is union with Greece, which was deeply problematic in that it was held in public in the church. However, it passed with overwhelming support, in large part due to the social pressures of having a public ballot in the church. This is significant in that it was used or will be used by nationalists up until this day. In 1960, independence came as a compromise. There was a coalition government that was founded with both the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot communities having a significant stake, the presidency and vice presidency respectively, both of whom had veto power. In 1974, there was a coup d'etat which overthrew this government. The coup d'etat was carried out by Greek nationalists who intended to make Cyprus or declare union with Greece. In response, Turkey invaded, establishing the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus, hereafter referred to as the TRNC or simply as the North. The majority of the population of the South is now Greek-speaking, identifies as Greek Cypriot, and the majority of the population of the North is now Turkish Cypriot. In 2004, a plan was put forth by then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan for reunification. A referendum was held on this item, and it passed overwhelmingly on the Turkish Cypriot side and failed fairly spectacularly in the Greek South. At the same time, the Republic of Cyprus, that is the state that now formally occupies the South, became a member of the European Union. My initial question was to look at why this reunification plan failed and why there still seemed to be a public support for the idea of reunification. In the process of doing research, I realized that my real question had more to do with what conceptions of nationhood were operating on the ground. So for some context, the existing literature is dominated by Professors Yannis Papadakis and Rebecca Bryant, and dates mostly from between 1998 and 2006, although there has been some written on the topic since then. It has been mostly in the form of dissertations, and there have been very few published pieces. It's dominated mostly by the divide between a Greek Cypriot model, or Greek model, and a Cypriot model. The Greek model is associated with the main center-right party, which is DISA, or Democratic Rally, and the Communist Party, which serves as the main leftist party. Between the two of them, they control about 75% of the vote, with the Greek model being associated with the right and the Cypriot model being associated with the left. Although the relationship is not perfect, we can see to some extent Laia Greenfeld's model of civic and ethnic nationalism playing out in these two models. That is to say that people who identify with the Greek model tend to articulate it based off of heritage terms, that is, ethnic terms, saying that we are Greek because our parents were Greek, we are Greek because we speak Greek, and we are Orthodox, and it's who we are. Whereas people who tend to identify with the Cypriot model and who, again, tend to identify with the Communist Party articulate their engagement with the state in terms of, or articulate citizenship in terms of our engagement with the state, excuse me. So in order to investigate this question, I spent 2 months this summer in Nicosia, Cyprus, which is the capital in the center of the island. It is one of the last divided capitals on Earth. I conducted interviews in the suburbs of Aglanja and Kaymakli. These two areas were predominantly left-leaning, so the majority of my interviews tended to be with Akel supporters. I got a few DC supporters, but they were fewer and further between. My three main findings that differed from the existing literature were an engagement between Greek and Cypriot models. That is to say that the people on the left who I interviewed tended to identify with, or to use ethnic arguments in articulating what they wanted for the state, despite the fact that they overall would still articulate a civic argument for citizenship. The second was this, based on the idea of the relationship with the European Union. So in 2006, a book was published which argued that as a result of EU accession, the supporters, who were in the majority, would move toward a more transnationalist position, would move away from national borders and into this internationalist order. As the EU has evolved and as countries have negotiated their relationship with it, it has become more acceptable to stick to a nationalist platform within the broader economic and political construct of the EU. Thus, although many people expressed support for the EU, this support was not articulated in terms of in substitution for support for national sovereignty. Finally, something interesting that I found was a explicit differentiation between ideal and pragmatic visions for the future. That is, virtually everyone I talked to, when I asked, what do you see, or what do you want moving forward, expressed both what they ideally want for the country and what they pragmatically think is possible. This differs, again, from the existing literature, which only speaks in terms of absolutes. That is, in response to the Anand Plan, the classical argument, or the existing established argument, says that people rejected it because they believed absolutely in sovereignty and were not willing to compromise. The idea that people are expressing a pragmatic vision of what they see as a viable solution suggests that there is a willingness to compromise. Again, though, these interviews were conducted on the left. I have only completed the first chapter, so if I can use the remaining time, I'd like to go into some of the arguments that I make in that chapter. So this is having to do with engagement between Greek and Cypriot models. Of those people on the right who I talked to, who were a very educated audience and who were attempting to argue that they constituted not Greek Cypriots, but Greeks of Cyprus, who actively argued for enosis, they did it not in terms, or not on national terms. That is to say, they did not say we should be part of Greece because we are Greeks. Rather, they argued that as a result of the 1949 referendum, they have a right to become Greeks because it represents the majority will of the population. This bowing to the idea of, for lack of a better term, popular sovereignty, would seem to indicate a the idea that the state apparatus or the proto-state apparatus is legitimate in its own right, rather than explicitly articulating a ethnic vision for what the nation state is. Perhaps more interestingly and more generalizably, because I was able to talk to more people on the left, civic nationalists tended to engage in an us and them discourse, which would seem to indicate the presence of a clear divide in their minds between Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, even while articulating a civic version of nationalism. The place where this was perhaps the most clear was the issue of Anatolian refugees. So since 1974, Turkey has resettled many Anatolian Turks in the north who have since had several, or who have since produced a couple of generations of people who have been born on the island and who represent a problem to future negotiations. They are viewed by some as illegal immigrants. By others, this is the only legitimate home they've ever had. Most of the people I talked to argued that the second generation and Turkish Cypriot should be able to stay, but were not willing to concede that Anatolian Turks and their descendants represented legitimate members of the state. They still argued that they constituted, and in articulating it, this argument was not in terms of legal arguments, it was in terms of ethnic and cultural difference. This cultural distinction would seem to indicate an engagement with the Greek model, even while publicly articulating the Cypriot model. This calls into question the rigidity of these two models and would suggest that either the political spectrum has moved slightly to the center and that there is more engagement, or that the existing literature is somewhat flawed in depicting this rigidity. Thank you all for your time.